All right, so this week's chapter is sex, gender, sexuality. And this chapter is a little bit of a problem in the same way that the race and ethnicity chapter is. And by that I mean we will have in sociology whole semesters devoted to race and ethnicity. We'll have whole semesters devoted to sexuality and whole semesters devoted to gender. So my problem is there's about this much to tell you, and I've got a day or 2 days to do that. The danger is that we end up not too abstract. The danger is we end up with too much stuff and we don't actually hit anything decently. First though, before we get too far into it, why don't you tell me a couple of thoughts you have regarding sex, gender, and sexuality, and I'll try and work them in today and tomorrow. So what are your concerns?
Like, you mean like interest in like gender roles, like how that plays like the society around us?
All right.
Like why is gender roles like in other cultures more like set necessarily?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. All right, that's good. We'll be talking a little bit about that right away, so that's helpful. Others?
I guess the science person, now you have like these kids growing up that even though like scientifically they might be male, they define themselves as female.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I don't actually have anything on there in that right now. There's a layer to everything we're going to end up talking about today and tomorrow that has to do with identity, and keep that in the back of your head because that's true of, it's not just true of sex and gender, but it's also true of sexuality, and we can talk about that a little bit. I put trans up here because in and of itself, that's what you described. But I also put identity up here because we might be able to touch on that. Go ahead. Were you putting your hand up? Okay. Any others?
Well, the only other thing I was wondering is like why sex in general has always had an age tied to it. Like it seems like sometimes younger is better, and like hundreds of years ago, but now it's to the point where like it keeps on like getting older and older. Like it's becoming like something that happens later.
I love it. That's awesome. So I'm going to put up here sex and age, and I'm going to put changes. All right, this is good stuff. Okay, super. So let me get started on the PowerPoint here, and feel free, raise your hand, holler out if you have any questions you want to get to. Because again, the ideas behind sex and gender, again, just like last time, race and ethnicity are so large that in order to make it sure that it's stuff you guys are interested in, I'm not being eloquent at all. In order to make sure it's the content that you guys are interested in, I kind of need feedback, or otherwise I'll do my own thing for an hour and that'll be that. Okay, so the subtitle here that I have, this is the only chapter I've done a subtitle for, but it can end up being the same subtitle for everything that we end up talking about throughout the semester. And that is that changes in gender don't happen in a vacuum. If anything, they happen as a result of other changes in society. And as long as we are focusing on the gender, but not on the structural changes that are causing those changes in gender, we might not have a great way of thinking about it. So, the first thing is, I just wanted to throw up a handful of definitions so everyone's clear about what we're talking about. Sex is your biological part. That's the part that you were mentioning. It's what's in your genes. Get it? That's funny. But seriously, it's your biology. Except for a handful of people, humans all fall into a pair of X's or an X and a Y, and that makes you a man or a woman. Assuming everything develops properly, that XX, XY makes for specific morphological differences with which I'm sure you're all very familiar. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. Okay. Now, gender ends up being all of the social stuff that goes along with that. Okay? Now, when people talk, they will often they'll often use the terms sex and gender interchangeably, and that's understandable, but in a technical sense, it's like a lot of other terms that we've talked about. In a technical sense, they mean two actually different things. So what you were describing about the person who biologically might be a male, but identifies on the outside as a female, that's a person that has a difference between their sex and their gender. If they go out in the world as a female, and the world accepts that person as a female, then he's a she, right? At least on the outside. And that's going to be the point that goes along with the trans. So you get a sense of the difference there. And yeah, totally. All right, in sexuality, again, I think you guys are probably pretty familiar with sexuality. It's who do you want to be with? Go ahead.
So is transgender or transsexual that the same thing?
So transgender is going to be a person who expresses differently on the outside than their biology is. Trans sex is the person who's had the surgery to be reassigned. Good question. I like it. Others? Okay. Who do you want to know biblically? All right. So if we go back to, say, the 40s in sociology, sex and gender roles were completely taken for granted by the sociologists as well. If you go and take any anthropology classes, some of the most strictest, I'm the most smartest professor there is this morning, some of the strictest differentiations in labor are gender divisions of labor. And that's true in our society too. So when you look at 1940s Westerners and compare them to tribalists around the world, obviously there are different gender roles. That's just the way things are, right? So when sociologists looked at this in the 40s, they didn't consider trans people. They didn't consider, they didn't consider it. It was obvious that there were gender roles, right? And so what they did is they analyzed the gender roles and they came up with these expressive versus instrumental terms, okay? Now the instrumental is kind of the guy's role, and essentially that's the person that gets things done, the GSD character, right? And then women have the expressive role, the love, okay? And in any sort of family, you'll notice, in any sort of stereotypical family, and think of our whole discussion revolving around media and the social psychology of the culture. Dad's going to be the one with the job. Mom's going to be the one who cooks dinner, right? There's not really two ways around that being our popular assumptions of men and women. I spent a shocking amount of time trying to prep this particular slide, looking around for pop culture images, but it was so ridiculously many I couldn't choose them. Do you choose Lucille Ball, who's an absolute screwball, completely irresponsible, and makes dinner, and Desi Arnaz, whom we only see when he's coming home from work and bringing home the paycheck? Do we choose Ward and June Cleaver of Leave It to Beaver fame? June, who always looks well-dressed in her house dress because she's got a, she's formal that way. And her hair is always perfect. Her makeup's perfect. She's always making dinner when the boys get home. She's not a pushover by any stretch of the imagination. But she's definitely in charge of the love. And when Dad comes home, if there's fatherly advice, she defers to him. Ward makes all the money, shows up in the afternoon with a briefcase and a suit. And then on Saturdays, he's in, I don't know, whatever the khakis equivalent of the 1950s were. And we could go all the way down the line. Brady Bunch for a 70s example, for the younger of us in here. But the Brady Bunch, you've got Mrs. Brady, who, now she doesn't have to do too much of the housework because they do have Alice, so they have two women to do the women's stuff. And what the heck is his name? It might be Michael. It is Mike. All right, see? Who's the architect, who's either architecting out of his home office or he's architecting out of his downtown office. But his job, once again, is to bring home the money and dispense fatherly advice. Okay? When something needs to get fixed, you call Dad. When something needs to be loved, you call Mom. This is such an ingrained part of our culture. Then I was thinking, the Jetsons? So even people imagining in the 60s, imagining forward into the future, and you still have absolutely traditional gender roles. The Flintstones, again, same thing, except they're imagining backwards. Of course, future forward and past stuff is always a reflection of the present more than anything else. But it just gives you a sense of how taken for granted, how deeply those gender roles run, okay? Now, so as I say there, it's 1940s functional sociology. And think about why we have these roles, okay? So a couple of weeks ago, we started talking about, well, no, let's wait on that. So most anything that you're going to complain about when it comes to sex and gender is going to be reflected in an understanding of this, okay? So those of you with pets, animals, dogs, cats, whatnot, which do you get fixed first? The bitch or the boy dog? The bitch. Why? Because if your boy dog gets the neighbor's dog pregnant, that's the neighbor's problem, right? Which do you get fixed? The Tom or the Queen? The Queen. I mean, the Tom's just going to make a mess. The Queen, you don't get that taken care of. It's, right, one after another. Huge mess. Terrible problem. Out on the farm, you fix the steers. You fix the bulls into steers because you precisely don't want that happening uncontrolled. But we do breed the girl cows very, very carefully, right? What's going on in this? Well, those are just biology examples. Not that, we're not a bunch of farm animals, right? But in a world where you're not allowed to fix your children, at least if you want grandchildren, and where you don't have good birth control or abortion, how do you keep people from reproducing, like bad pets? And the answer is, you keep an eye on your children. Now, which children do you keep an eye on? Well, it's the same answer, isn't it? You keep an eye on the girls. Because if the neighbor boy knocks up your daughter, your problem. If your son knocks up the neighbor's daughter, well, right? It's sad, but it's 100%. It makes perfect sense when you think about it that way. You can also see, this one I think is really fascinating. We take for granted that breastfeeding is a good option for children. You should probably breastfeed as long as you can tolerate, and your neighbors aren't too mean to you about it. Not everyone can, of course, but it's the way it is. At what point did the woman who whelped the child not have to actually nurse the child? The answer to that is going to be like in the last 100 years. And the early formulas weren't even all that great, right? So in the past, if you wanted to have children, but you didn't want to be carrying one around on each mammary, how did you deal with it? Well, only the super rich could afford to hire someone to wet nurse their children. Like, you're actually going to pay someone who is also pregnant, who also has children, to nurse your children, right? How much would that cost? In today's dollars, it's you just couldn't, But if you were super rich in the old days, you probably had servants. Well, how super rich do you have to be to have that many servants? That one of them's young and pregnant and willing to nurse, right? It's just not a thing. So, go ahead.
Okay, then I'm just not understanding how where the actual mother's milk wouldn't that just be painful? Just not going anywhere.
Yes. But it's painful for all moms when they decide to stop? Unless
You're
they...
just not doing it all. Like, you never do it. It's just...
They have medication to help dry them up.
I don't know, I heard the cabbage leaves thing.
She used cabbage leaves and eggs baby.
So you guys still believe in the cabbage leaves?
Yeah, they work. They work.
All right, there you go, in hot water. I'm a man. I had heard the cabbage leaves 15 years ago when my children were babies. I figured it was made up. But if you guys say it works, I will trust you. But yes, it's uncomfortable. Or at least it's my understanding it's uncomfortable. We'll say that. But that's also, like, for that same flexibility is why you can have the Irish wet nurse take care of it too. Because you're going to make however... I really am not qualified to talk about this. But you're going to make whatever you actually need. So, if somebody nurses the kid till the kid's 4, by the time the kid's 4, he's not going to need much. She's not going to be making much. That's not going to be painful at all. If you're British and it's 1800 and you've got an Irish wet nurse who's already got a baby, then all you got to do is put yours into the rotation and she's going to double it up. You'll notice the same thing works with cattle, right? I mean, again, not to be too farmish about it, but you can put your milk cows on a 2-a-day cycle and they'll do great. If you have enough feed and enough farm help, you can put them on a 3-a-day cycle, and they're not going to go up exactly 50%, but it'll go up enough. So, yeah, isn't it cool? The world is amazing. I don't understand it, but it's amazing. You are trolling me. I have no response to that. So now this is sort of exactly so when you complain about something like the sexual double standard, right? There is a double standard because people watch their daughters. Why do they watch their daughters? Because you're the one that's got to deal with the headache if it's the old days and the kid is pregnant. You don't watch your son so much because you don't have to, right? Someone else gets to worry about that, right? Now there's one more tidbit to this, and let's back up a little bit. There's one more tidbit to this, and I'm kind of waffling on if we should talk about this now or if we should talk about this in the family section. But we'll throw it out now and we'll get to it later in the family section. The social problems folks have already heard this, but if you take this a step further, you'll notice this also really helps explain pairing, dating and mating, what we think is sexy, right? Because if what a man brings to the table is his job, his money, does he have to be physically attractive? Not really, what's most important about a man, especially in this world, is that he have a good job. Now, if we went back more than 100 years, how many women put up with an okay marriage to an okay guy because he could provide well for her and her children? A lot of women, right? Now, there are echoes of this in today's culture. Even now, if we said, well, let me go back to the women first. All right, so if women are bringing love to the table, then what does that actually mean? Well, to be frank, it means they're bringing their sexuality, right? So in bringing their sexuality to the table, if, I don't know what else to say. She's bringing her sexuality to the table. But it's not just coitus. It's not just intercourse. It's the whole suite of junk that comes with sexuality, right? Because if there's going to be kids, she's got to be on board, right? And if it's the old days, she's got to feed them. And if there's, because of that, those two things, all of the mess of love work, expression work, housework ends up on her plate. Does that make sense? The guy's off making money. The more money he makes, the better. So her job is to make love. You don't tend to think of the olden days as prostitution, but that's exactly what's going on here, right? All a prostitute does is trade sex for money on a nightly or hourly basis. Our grandmothers did it on a lifetime basis. The man you hook up with is an investment, right? Now, if you're paying attention, yes, I just called your grandmother a prostitute. I love your grandma. I'm not picking on her, but I'm saying this is the trade-off, right? Now, again, so what do we think is attractive with women, especially if we are going back just 20 years. We don't have to go back 100 years, it's just 20 years for this. Well, a couple of interesting things come out of this. One, yes? Alrighty? Nope, you're fine. All right, hold on. Yeah, because I think things are changing, and that's also a very important part of this whole conversation. It's better if the door is shut, right? So how do women be more attractive? And the answer is be more naked, right? Now, why is it not an acceptable pattern for a man to try and be more attractive for women by being more naked? Because he's fundamentally misunderstanding what she likes about him, right? Not that there aren't some guys who are plenty good eye candy. That's not what I'm saying. But if the average guy tries to tarch up his clothing a little bit, it's not going to have the effect he thinks it's going to have. Whereas the average woman can tarch up her clothing a little bit, and she's going to bat a little better than average at the bar that night, right? Now, the evolutionary psychologists that talk about this, and I don't want to go too far down their role, but the evolutionary psychologists that talk about this will look at a couple of things, and they'll slide the double standard in here as well. But then I'm going to offer a sociological perspective, which is better. But if you think about the way men and women's biological reproductive system works, women have a limited number of eggs, and it's better if they cash them in when they're young. And it takes 9 friggin' months to sit on that egg, and then when it pops out, like think of your baby cow, right? We're back to the farm again. Baby cow, splat, hits the ground. An hour later, the thing's up and nursing. And by the end of the day, it's wandering around, and by day 3, it's talking to the other calves, okay? When you think about the human baby, you have to teach the damn thing to nurse, right? And it's not going to talk significantly for 8-9 months, and even then, it's just going to be babbling to you. It's probably not going to be that mobile till that point in time, and it's still not off running around with his friends in the pasture. He's just able to be mobile enough so that mom never gets to sleep or rest for the next 4 years, right? Okay, now there's some significant stuff that goes on with that, but we're going to put that on the back shelf. But I'll give you one little tidbit. Notice how much time we spent talking about that ability to think creatively and symbolically, and to be able to learn from those symbols. Okay, the argument's going to be that cow has most everything it needs as hardwired instinct, whereas everything that the human needs has to be uploaded, right? So you have to have a lot of brains, and there's no way for mom to grow the human baby to the point that it's developmentally as mature, because then she's got to squeeze it out. And how big is a 9-month-old's head? That ain't happening, is it? So in order to get that computer, which is, one way of thinking about what we have, our main survival thing, in order to get it out, baby's born relatively premature. I say relative to the other mammals. The other mammals are all born out here. Humans are born here, because otherwise, baby's not coming out. Still in the old days, now our medicine's pretty good, but in ye olden days, we lost a lot of women to childbirth. But evolution's not going to back that up till the baby's smaller, because you're going to end up losing more babies, right? Everything's a trade-off. Everything's a compromise. There's no free lunch. Okay, see? Isn't that crazy? That's cool, isn't it? At any rate, so we're birthing these kind of premature babies that then require a tremendous amount of nurturing because they're premature, okay? So that means that child rearing for a woman is at least a 5-year endeavor. And in our world, it's more like a 25-year endeavor, okay? So there's a maximum capacity a woman has on how much she can reproduce. Now, if she's got a stable partner that sticks around, those old-fashioned farm families, they could hit 7 or 10 pretty easily. There's those people on TV that are up to like 24 children. It's not, it's only 19. But still. Without being too flagrantly gross, every time a man thinks about sex, he wastes millions of chances at reproduction, right? Millions, okay? So a woman's got a finite number of eggs, less than 100,000, and to have any of those grow to adulthood, it's a 5, 10, 15-year commitment. A man, all he has to do is talk someone into sleeping with him, and he's got a shot at spawning children, quite literally. Like a video game, Respawn. But anyway, so that's where the evolutionary psychologists are going to go. They're going to say we have a double standard because women need to be sexually chaste and ridiculously faithful, maybe not to her husband, but at least to the child, in order for her to pass her genes on. Whereas a man, from a reproductive perspective, the less faithful a man is, the more successful he's going to be from a reproductive strategic standpoint. Does that make sense? Okay, well, here's the Soc take on this, or at least my understanding of the Soc take on this. Uh-oh. There was one more thing. came and it went and it stopped everything. Oh well. All right. So if we go back here, this is the second point. That's going to be the evolutionary psychologist, the sociobiologist perspective on men and women and the double standard. But from a social perspective, now remember I said men are bringing their money to the table and women are bringing their sexuality to the table. You'll notice in an old-fashioned relationship, if the man is bringing money and she's bringing their sexuality, then you've got a pretty straightforward money for sex trade, right? And it's not just, again, not just intercourse, it's the whole suite of family-ness, okay? If that's the trade, how much does a man's sex matter? Not really at all, does it? So why would anybody police his sexuality if that's not what he's bringing to that contract? Does that make sense? He's bringing his money. We'll get back to that in a sec. Now, if a woman is bringing her sexuality to the table, then her sex is an explicit understanding of that contract. So if she's having sex with somebody else, that's not what the contract says, right? And considering that if she conceives with someone else, that's a certain amount of time taken out of her very limited biological window, that's sort of a problem for the husband over here. Husband's you get what I'm saying. Okay. So from a sociological perspective, the double standard represents that what we value about women is their sexuality. And so consequently, we police that. If you want something similar on the male side, especially in the old days, you're going to have to go find the mistress. All right? Now, how much support does the mistress's kid get? None, right? Not only that, we have a specific term, which is a bad word for the mistress's child. It's the bastard, right? Very good. You guys are on board. And specifically, what does a bastard get? Nothing. Right? Now, if the man had fostered a couple of children with a mistress and was supporting her on the side, would the wife have reason to be pissed? Oh, hell yes. Every bit as much right as he has to be pissed if she's sleeping around on him. Because what he's bringing to the table is money. What she's bringing to the table is sexuality. All right? So this is where I was going with all of this. It was kind of a long circuitous route. So how does a man get sexy? He gets a better job and buys better clothing. Why? Because it shows that he's actually put together. Can a man be sexually attractive as he ages? Yes. In fact, many men get better looking as they age. Why? Well, if what we value about them is their ability to make a living, you'll notice a 40-year-old guy is he's way better off than a 20-year-old guy. 20-year-old guy could go all night long, but you're not going to go far with an $8 job. Like, hey, babe, let's go to Sonic for dinner. That's not going to win, right? The 40-year-old guy that's got a good job, no, we're not going to Sonic to dinner. We're going to go to Atlanta. We're going to hit the Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. We're going to get a nice hotel, baby, and we're riding there in my Lexus, right? And no, we're not going to go all night because I need sleep. See what I'm getting at? But with her, like, it's a little bit unfair, but a lot of women tell me, I don't believe it, but a lot of women tell me that if you're 25, you're over the hill. If you're 30, people just don't think 30-year-old women are pretty anymore. Again, I don't believe it, but look at the logic behind this. Why would this be the case? Well, you know when the best time to have a kid biologically is? Something like 18, right? And every woman in here who's had more than one child will say, yeah, the closer you get to 30, the harder and harder it is, right? It's worse than running a marathon. It's terrible. It's terrible.
Back in the day, like if you weren't married and had kids by the time you're 15, you were like considered an old maid.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes if that isn't a little bit overstated, but the idea is pretty good. You want to get people hooked up because that window shuts quickly. And it shuts on us as well. We like to pretend it doesn't, but when we talk about 40-year-olds having children, and some do, some absolutely do. It's not it happens. But your fertility starts to slide off at about 30. You don't hear about it because people who are 40 who wish they had children are often a little sad about it, but that's because they wish they had, right? The very definition. And if they're out spending $10,000 or $15,000 a pop per go at fertility treatments and they're not working, are they going to tell you? We tried fertility treatments 3 times and it was $45,000. We still don't have any children and I'm sad. No, that's not the kind of thing people say in public. So consequently, you don't hear about the, I won't say failures, but I'll say the non-successes, right? And in a world where we tell young people, you can have it all, it's not really 100% true, right? You can focus on family, but that's going to hurt your career. You're going to focus on career, that's going to reduce your family chances. I'm not allowed to say that. I shouldn't even record it because I'm not allowed to say it. And so, so that plays in. But yes, that was a good question. All right. How are we doing so far? Okay, groovy? All right, now here's the thing. Over the last 100 years in our society, and especially over the last 40, these things have been changing at a lightning speed. Okay? So the first is, in our world, sex and reproduction don't necessarily go together. Right? In the past, that was not the case. That's the whole point. We police our daughters because sex and reproduction go together, especially when you're 18. Like, she looks at a boy wrong, she's going to end up pregnant. Not my daughter. See how that works? But in today's world, people can be sexual and they don't have to be parents, right? So, interesting tidbit, I'm sure you guys are all aware of this, but the high schools that don't have some form of sex ed are, at least my understanding, last time I saw this, and it turns up over and over and over again, they have schools that don't have sex ed have more teen pregnancy than schools that do have sex ed. The schools without sex ed have more STDs because, people hit a certain age, and we already covered this. The system is built to trick you into replicating, right? Like, what the hell? Exactly. And so we can actually bring these things in, which make it so that you don't have to have kids. And look at the things that come out of that. So I put decent formula up here. I'm not going to deviate. Of course, it's best to breastfeed. Talk to your pediatrician, not your sociology prof. Breastfeeding's still better than formula in most cases, blah, blah, blah. Again, so unqualified to talk about this, it's not even funny. But today's formula is pretty good, right? Many of you were formula babies, and, well, look at you. It's not a problem, right? So you don't have to breastfeed. When you talk to moms who are breastfeeding, who are trying to still work, you get this long list of headaches. It just makes your heart break for them. They have to step out every 2, 3, 4 hours to go pump. If they don't, they start leaking through their shirt, which is kind of embarrassing in a professional context. Many employers are more down with the idea of supporting sex and gender than they are the reality. So it's not like she's going to pump at the office in the cubicle in the office, right? She's going to be sitting on the toilet, hardly hygienic, hardly comfortable, hardly enjoyable. And so eventually she sort of gives up. Not only that, Americans are ridiculously queasy. Facebook won't even let you put nursing babies on Facebook, right? Because, boobs! Go ahead.
I was going to say, as a mother who nursed 3 children and went to work and had to do all that, the employers really are not as supportive as they say they are.
Yeah, well, see, and I'm giving the formula. I'm giving the employers the benefit of the doubt on this one, absolutely. And those of you with experience will know I'm giving them way more benefit of the doubt than most of them deserve. And it just is what it is, right? But in a world with formula, you're not stuck nursing the baby. You don't have to deal with that. And you can feed your baby just fine. Kid's not going to die. And you can go to work if you need to, right? So that's number one. And for that, we're looking back at about roughly 100 years. A little bit longer than that. And people always supplemented babies with stuff. Only, it maybe was cow's milk, or there was a weird one the Icelanders had. I think it was like melting butter in a cheesecloth and having the baby suck that. I like the modern world. All right. The second one is decent birth control. And when you start thinking about the changes in the culture over the last 40 years, you cannot think about it without understanding the role good birth control has played, right? So first of all, in the past, many states didn't even allow birth control to be sold, right? Secondly, even when they did, the birth control that we had wasn't as good as the stuff we have nowadays. So you're looking at the 60s by the time easy, effective, daily birth control pills are available for women. And if you care, you can go do more research on it because I didn't go that far back. And the stuff that women use nowadays compared to stuff that women used in the 60s is, again, almost night and day, because they're very, very, very minute amounts of hormone in order to control the system compared to the 60s when they're sort of like whacking it with sledgehammers worth of hormones. So it's even better, even safer, even less intrusive, blah, 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 you get it. Okay, do you think we could have possibly had 1968 Summer of Love without good birth control? We'd have the summer of 45-year-old children, right? There'd be gazillions of people my age. You couldn't have had the Summer of Love. When did women start going into the workplace? Well, again, it's going to be right around the 70s. When did divorce laws start to change and loosen up? Early 70s, right? All this stuff is going on, and cheap, legal, effective birth control is absolutely a part of it. And it's backstopped by, again, I realize not everyone's going to be, woohoo, but it's backstopped by safe, legal abortion, right? In the past, people still had abortions, but they weren't legal and they weren't safe, right? So in that world, in a world where sex is fun and doesn't have to be resulting in children, in that world, we can change how we think of women, right? And in fact, we have changed how we think of women. And this is why, when I was talking earlier, I was saying, if we think 15 or 20 years ago, because the amount of time that has passed since we had this scientific and cultural revolution is 40 years. We've had 1/2 human life, 1 generation. Well, 2 generations since this all went down. So if it sometimes feels to you like gender is all over the map, like things are completely up in the air, like things are changing faster than you can imagine, Well, this is why. The fundamental structure of society that upheld the gender roles has changed. And we're changing to figure out how that's going to net out, right? All right, so over here on the, I guess it's the right-hand side, we've expanded women's roles in society as well. Now this is both legal as well as a result of the scientific. That's why I put them together, because they really do go together. But we expect women to be in the workplace, not just a little bit, but a lot. And in the past, of course, women worked. We sometimes, I think, in our like, yay, yay, feminism, equality, I think sometimes we forget that in the past women worked. We just called them poor women. And many women did awesome jobs. What's changed is the average, right? And so nowadays, what can a woman do? Well, the real question is, what can't a woman do? And the answer is, there's not a thing she can't do. But before this revolution, when a woman hit the workforce, what jobs did she end up with? Well, support jobs. Isn't that interesting? So exactly what we expected women to do in the home, when they went into the workplace, that's what we had them do there. So, of course, everyone knows doctors are a pain in the ass. That's why you have nurses. Nurses love the patients. Nurses support the doctors, right? But notice how that's exactly the model of the household. If dad's the doctor and mom's the nurse and the patients are the children, oh my goodness, look how straightforward that is. Women make great secretaries, don't they? They support the boss, they love the customer, and they leave the boss to discipline the customers, right? It's exactly the same support role. But in a world where sex and gender don't have to go together like that, women don't have to be in the support role, and so they're not. There are elements of that still in the workforce, which I can spend a little bit of time talking about. I didn't prep it with the PowerPoint, but we do have enough time to talk a little bit about the wage gap if you want, because it plays onto this. But let's go a couple more on this one. Yeah, all right. So the second one here says, thoughts about marriage and coupling changing. It's entertaining to read stuff from the 60s and 70s, and even Mad Men did a spoof on this. I don't know how many of you would have watched that season or episodes. I didn't watch much of it. But the divorcee, right, moves into the neighborhood, and they're all scandalized. Oh, well, what are we going to do with this girl, right? If we go back to before this revolution in the 60s, divorce is a failure. I mean, children from divorced families, they come from broken families. It's better to stay together for the children than to get out of a relationship unless the relationship is a total disaster, right? And in many ways, people complain about the divorce rate nowadays. It's something like 40, 50%. Turns out it's harder to measure than you think it is. People complain about the divorce rate nowadays. You can absolutely frame that the other way. The fact that 50 or 60% of marriages stay together for a significant amount of time is itself a success. In today's world, you expect to marry your best friend, your soulmate. You expect to have a kick-ass sex life until you're old. And if any of those things change, you know what you do nowadays? You get the hell out. You know what happened in the 50s? If your sex life sucked, nothing. If you were him, you could maybe find a little side piece, but if you were her, you were just sort of stuck. If it wasn't your soulmate, I don't even know if people in the 50s would have talked about their partner as their soulmate. I mean, that's what you got girlfriends for. That's what you have like the bowling guys for. I'd rather go drink beer with the bowling guys than talk about a stereotype, bowling guys, whatever. I'd rather go have beers at the club with the other faculty than go home and hang out with my wife. But, she's there. She does fine. That would have been adequate. And love, little Love's what you need to fire up the relationship and get it started. That's all. And in many situations, many cultures, you wouldn't worry about love at all because, right, you're marrying who they picked out for you to marry. And those were all decent relationships. They were effective. They wouldn't match our definition of a happy relationship because our standards really are so high. Does that make sense? Now, again, this goes along with our changes about marriage. And sometimes I wonder, I'm not sure about this, but I kind of get the vibe that the youngsters aren't even getting married. But that'll be interesting. Okay, and this here says sexual mores trending together. And what that means specifically is that men and women's sexual behavior is getting closer and closer and closer. Okay? So it used to be that men had an earlier sexual initiation than girls, i.e. they lost their virginity earlier. It used to be that men had significantly more sexual partner than women. And what you're finding is that women's number of sexual partners is going up, and I don't know if the boys is coming down, but their age of first intercourse is getting closer and closer together, right? And all I have to do is listen to my, in the back of my head, think of my mother complaining about girls calling the house, right? I know, it's amazing to me too. Like, a girl called my house when I was a teenager. But a girl couldn't be that forward. And in today's world, absolutely, if you like someone, text them up. Not a problem. You don't have to play coy. That's so old-fashioned, it's not even funny. And yet, again, 40 years ago, the idea that you'd be the one getting the phone number, that you'd be the one paying for a date, that you'd be the one making the first, initiating the first communication. If you're a girl, no way, man. You were, they have words for that.
But then again, it all comes back to the cow.
Yes.
But I think like the marriage thing is kind of the same. Like, for instance, I'm a single mom. So I get like looked at weird, like, oh, you haven't started a relationship again, you haven't gotten married again, you're not living with somebody again. So like once you get to a certain point, like especially single mom, society still expects you to like, oh, well, you haven't moved on from your ex or something. It's still like awkward to be like, what do you mean you don't have another man? You know,
Too busy with your kids and going to school and having a job.
yeah, but some people it's still like, oh, well, you should be married because he needs a father in his life. So it's still kind of, I think it depends where you're at.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's really intriguing about this, and this takes a little bit longer to explain than I think we have time for. We could try. But I think that if you try and understand sex roles, and I think this is going to be true of race and ethnicity from last time as well. If you try and understand changing sex roles, part of what's going on is there are generational changes that unless you break it out generationally, you won't actually see, right? So when someone says there's not enough women CEOs, of course they're right on the one hand, it's not 50-50, but would we expect women CEOs now? This gets to be an interesting question, because how old is a CEO? Well, they're like 70. You don't get to be the CEO when you're 35 years old unless you're Zuckerberg and start something and it ends up huge. If you're going to work your way up through GE, it's going to take a long time. You're going to be in your 60s. Well, if you're 60, what's this, 15? If you're 65 now, when did you enter the workforce? 1970? You'd have been 20 in 1970? Am I doing my math right? And was the workplace different in 1970 for a 20-year-old woman than a 20-year-old woman in 1990? Absolutely. And is that different than the workforce for a 20-year-old woman in 2010? Absolutely, because there's been changes at every level there. And so once you start breaking it down generationally, then you start to see some other changes too, including including how people are paid, right? Including how far they've been able to go in their career. And so that needs to be taken into account. I don't know. I could give you more, but I'm not sure you want it. That was good. So consequently, depending upon your age, right? If you were 50 and you're a single mom, which she's not, just saying. If you were 50 and a single mom, people might like, oh, well, that's just, what a shame. You never hooked up again, right? And I'm not kidding. Like, if you're a 60-year-old widow and you've been without a partner for 20 years, people kind of feel bad for you, like you're an old maid. Like, you're not an old maid. You had a rockin' love affair with this dude, and he passed because men just aren't that durable. And that was that, right? You're not an old maid. But in today's world, you might not even... So that's 60. 40? If you're 40 and you went and you had a relationship and you have a kid, I don't know if anyone's going to expect you to hook up again. Yeah, I did that. It was okay. Right? Because the people we're talking about are different. Now, I'm hypothesizing here. We'd have to actually go out and test this, but I think you get the sense of what I'm saying. And the 20-year-olds, we got to wait and see how they net out in their behavior. But they don't seem all that interested in marriage. So, yeah, good. Good. I like it. Okay. So here's where... Here's where I was kind of waffling, because if we were going to do a whole semester on this, or even a few weeks on this, we could spend a day talking about each and every one of these things. If you cruise on over to, I don't know, Tumblr or Instagram or Facebook's full of old people, and actually pay attention to what the young social justice people are saying, the young feminists are saying, these things are going to come up over and over and over again, right? And it's worth spending a little bit of time on. So the first thing is, well, let's actually start at the bottom. So slut shaming. One of the things that I was trying to think of a word for this, and maybe you guys have a word. My 16-year-old did not. So maybe there isn't actually a word. But if you pay attention to what happens on the internet, every so often someone will say something wrong, and then the internet, it seems to be especially bad with Twitter. Then the internet forms a lynch mob. And in many ways, these social media outlets have they're awesome, but they've also given us access to some of our worst elements. Because you see something, you get pissed, and then people do terrible things to people. People lose jobs and all sorts of stuff. All right. One of the things that strikes me about this is that when you watch, if the person who's getting piled on is a woman, things end up negative, not just negative.
Being bullied.
Yeah, but being female bullied, right? Go ahead.
Wasn't there a coach or something that had his daughter just get accepted to a school playing soccer or something, and all of a sudden the Twitter world just pounced on her, called her every name in the book, a slut and everything like that? I mean, just said wild things. Is that where you're going with this?
Kind of. I remember that one too. But that's kind of exactly what I'm going to say. So that's exactly it. If someone pisses you off on the internet, and instead of saying, my goodness, that person's an asshole, or even, my goodness, that woman's a bitch, which is gendered language, notice. If the put-downs used are cunt, whore, slut, right? Those are all female put-downs, right? And they're using them because it's the vilest thing you can say to a woman. Now, if the person did something bad enough that you think you can haul out the worst, then fair enough, that is what it is. But you have to really wonder where the culture is at and wonder where your head is at when, because it's a woman, you end up with these female put-downs. And what's interesting about this, and this is where, and I'm a terrible feminist, but this point stands, because I said so. what kind of words do we have like that for men? And the answer is we don't, right? You can call someone a dick, and it's sort of a gendered put down, but many of the things that we expect out of men are aggressive and obnoxious, and so many dickish behaviors actually aren't bad things for guys. Go ahead.
Well, the word beta is used to describe a man who's not, masculine.
Yes, which is wonderful too, because how many ways to put down a man actually are feminine, right? You can call him a beta, which isn't feminine, but it does mean you're not a winner. But we could call him a pussy. We could call him a sissy. All these other things, which are, you are really more like a woman than a man, right? So right there, and this is where the cultural tidbit of this comes in, and this is sort of a valid. I see this as a valid point. Regardless of strides we've made in equality, regardless of the fact that we think of women more highly now, at least in terms of their public capacity, than we ever have in the past, it's still the case that women and femininity are a notch below men. Now we're talking about averages across the culture, because obviously there are corners where women are doing better than men and corners where women are more highly thought of than men. But often the people involved in these Twitter pile-ons, notice who's on Twitter? Are old people on Twitter? No, right? So the sad thing is these are the young folks who really should be the ones who are more forward-thinking, and they're the ones who are using these gendered put-downs, right? If you don't like someone, that's fine. Call them whatever name you want. But if what you're going to call them is a feminine put-down, that's actually kind of obnoxious, isn't it? Here's an example from last week. When would it be okay for a white person who is pissed off at the black guy that cut him off? Oh, it got silent. To use the N-word to describe that person. Never. You can call him an asshole. You can call him a terrible driver. You can call him an obnoxious son of a bitch. But you can't use the N-word. Why? Because that's the point of privilege. And so when reasonably savvy internet boys are putting down internet girls, Gamergate, right, by calling them cunts, what worse word could a white guy use to put down a black guy than the N-word? Nothing. You want to hurt someone? That's about as bad as it's going to get. And you're not allowed to go there because you shouldn't go there. We're trying to make it better. So be pissed, don't use that word. But when it comes to gender, this is exactly what's going on. Go ahead.
It's like 18-year-old girl, she's had sex with like 10 guys, people start calling her a slut. But an 18-year-old boy who's had sex with 10 girls, you call him like a man whore, they're like, oh yeah, that's right.
Well, and that
That's the coolest thing in the world. You're like, yeah, I had sex with 10 chicks,
Mm-hmm.
So
And that
it's okay for the guys to be able to sleep with 10 chicks, but it's not okay for the girl, to sleep with 10 guys. She's labeled a whore, a slut, Sounds like my brother.
And that, go ahead. Oh, not raising your hand, he's rooting. Go girl. Yeah, absolutely. If you believe in equality, now dig this. If you believe in equality, you should have the same standards for men and women, right? So if it's not okay for a woman to sleep with 10 men, it's not because she's a woman, it's because you think of sex differently than she does. And should it be okay for a man? No. And if it's okay for a man to sleep with 10 women, then it should be okay for a woman. I mean, that's actually what equality means. Now, you can try in your individual everyday life to hold both standards, and that's what you should do, to hold both to the same standard. That's what you should do as a person going forward, because the old world is crumbling behind us. There's only one way, and that's forward. But, right, that whole thing about how culture influences our thinking, if you find yourself, fairly easily, you're going to find yourself going in different directions. And here's the other thing, right? At what point are someone else's sexual behaviors your business? Right? Why does it matter to me how many sexual partners you've had? It doesn't. Regardless if you're a woman or a man, whose business is your sex life? Yours. Don't ask me to raise your children, but it's your business, right? And consequently, shag who you want to shag. I don't care. But that's a different way of thinking than the old days, because the old days was very, very specific. But the old days is based on a different culture and economy than we have now. Go ahead.
When did it become normal for people to have intercourse before marriage in the first place?
Always. Oh, wait, birth control. So that's what this is about, right? If it was not normal to have sex outside of marriage, we wouldn't have an entire chunk of religion, morality, parents, priests, brothers with shotguns, fathers with machetes. If people weren't sexing enough to be stressed about it, you wouldn't have to have all that stuff. Does that make sense? But again, who you're with is your business, right? If you listen to this, if you listen to a certain kind of speaker, and I don't mean political, I mean there's a lot of people that do this. Anyone who goes around talking about ye olden days, or kids these days, or wasn't it great way back when? That's a rhetorical tactic that's really easy to do, because for whatever reason, all of us have a streak of nostalgia, and it seems to be pretty deeply rooted in the culture. So it's easy for me as a speaker to say, oh, remember the old days, and then start talking about good things from the old days. It's very easy to look back on elements of old-fashioned morality and take them, in Catholicism, someone that did this with the religion, you'd call them a cafeteria Catholic. Oh, I'll take this and I'll take this, but I'm not going to take that. When you think about the way people behaved sexually in the old days, it's easy to imagine they were more chaste than they were. It's easy to imagine that they were more chaste than they were. So when we start thinking about the old days, keep this stuff in mind, right? When did the Catholic Church have problems with priests and altar boys? Forever, right? Now, is it because there's anything special about the Catholic priests? No, it's because people are sexual. When did homosexuality exist? Forever. Only nowadays we don't beat them up and drag them behind the truck if we find a gay dude, right? When did girls get pregnant out of wedlock? Always. So most nunneries, you might not know this, most nunneries had daycares, and it wasn't because the nuns were getting knocked up. It's because when your daughter did get knocked up, there's some boys, even if you knock my daughter up, you're not marrying her. If that was you sent your kid to the monastery. Did you know that a female monastery is still a monastery? A nunnery is also a monastery. So you send her off to the convent, and she'll be visiting Aunt Millie for about a year. Kid will be born, nuns will raise the children up. So there were often lots of orphanages. Go out, not on your mom's computer, and Google up Victorian porn. Be sure you use your sneak mode, because you will find that the people who were famous for getting turned on by ankles were every bit as dirty as the Pirate Bay. So the real thing is, these things exist because humans are sexual, and in a world where there's outcomes, we're trying to, through sheer force of fear and terror and shame and humiliation get them to stay on the straight and narrow, and they still didn't make it. And in today's world, we don't use fear, humiliation, shame, and terror. You can't possibly say this is anything like the Victorians.
Oh, well, okay.
The fact that we still do slut shaming is part of this, right? There is good reason for single moms to be nervous, however. They might not face moral terror, but they should, and many of you know this, face economic terror, so it's a different sort of a problem. A few people, perhaps many people, waited in the olden days. Certainly not all, and probably not as many as you think. That's what the book mentions, the Kinsey report, and he was a sex researcher all throughout the middle of the century, and there was a movie a couple of years ago about him, but I never watched it. So go see it if you want to find it. And what was interesting about that is, this is awesome. They actually found that people's sex lives haven't changed that much, even from then till now. Only everybody thought back then, according to Kinsey, that folks did this and only this, and they did this once a month. And when they actually started interviewing people on the kind of sex they actually had, it was all the fun stuff that you're probably already doing. And but folks were too embarrassed to even tell their neighbors or their friends. Hey, did you ever think of doing this with your spouse? Oh, I can't believe you. Of course. Right? Oh, no. How could we? And, oh boy, could we write a tutorial for them. So the reality is, and here's the way I think about this. I'll let you go in 35 seconds here. You'll hear people say sex is a choice. You'll hear people say sex is inborn. You'll hear people say sex is changing. My model for this always is people are horny as hell. And in order for evolution to work, you don't need to worry about gayness or bisexuality. You don't need to worry about morality. Morality here is a way to constrain that force, but that force has to be more powerful than even your culture's morality. All you really need is enough people to be horny enough that you end up with some pregnancies, right? Pregnancies, despite the fact everyone's not fertile all the time, pregnancies, despite the fact that the culture is trying to get you to stop. And you know what the parents are trying to do? They're trying to not have more kids too. Chances are 99% of the people in here are using birth control because the system will put more fertility on you than you want to actually deal with, right? So that's what you want to, that's the model I use. Good question though. All right. I would ask if you had anything else to say, but I'm done. Thanks. Have a good Monday, Tuesday, whatever today is.